I do is original oratory. What I do is essentially write a speech for 10 minutes, and I remember the whole thing, and then I perform it to people. So the title of my speech is called The Great American Tragedy, and I hope you enjoy it. On December 19th, 1777, General George Washington and his poorly fed, ill-equipped army staggered to Valley Forge. The chilling winds blew the army prepared for winter's fury, many of them without basic necessities such as food, proper clothing, or shelter. So severe were conditions for these men that at times Washington despaired that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army will inevitably starve, dissolve, disperse. And indeed, it seemed that prospects for future campaigning seemed bleak. And yet, they braved the cold. In the dead of winter, when all hope had seemed lost to these courageous men, they hardened their resolve and rode out the storm. They did so not on behalf of a particular tribe or lineage, but on behalf of larger ideas. The idea of freedom and liberty, the idea of God-given and unalienable rights. And when the snow melted, these men were the ones who overthrew a tyrannical empire and helped establish a truly free and independent nation. Those men of Valley Forge were among our first patriots. As we begin our 4th century as a nation, I believe it's fitting to pause for a moment and reflect on the meaning of patriotism, theirs and our own. Today in the 21st century, we still talk a great deal about what it means to be patriotic. And while there still continues to be debate surrounding this issue, we all have to wonder what exactly is patriotism in the context of our time. Not long ago, patriotism was considered the loved one's birthplace, the place of childhood recollections, of hopes and dreams and aspirations. Not long ago, patriotism was considered tales of great deeds and conquests, that a mother would tell us about beside her knee. But if that were patriotism, then one can observe today that many Americans are struggling with conflicting emotions towards American patriotism. The childhood recollections have been replaced with work and toil. The tales of great conquests and deeds have been replaced with tales of grief, sadness, and tears. One can look around themselves in the world we live in today and see that the world has taken an increasingly cynical view of America that we all know and love. The effect? Americans have lost their sense of patriotism. Now, this is distressing news that we as Americans have lost our pride in our nation, and that we fail to realize the impact this problem could have on our nation. So the goal of this speech is to answer one question: how do we as Americans recapture that pride, that patriotism? To help combat this issue, I'd like to discuss the mission topics. First, I'd like to discuss why Americans have lost a sense of patriotism and what effects it could have on our nation. Next, I'd like to share a Native American perspective that I believe should be heard. And finally, I want to remind all those who feel lost why there is still hope. To begin, I'd like to ask you all some questions. What does America mean to you? What is freedom and unity? What makes a country truly strong? We reflect on these questions because we're in the midst of a raging storm. A storm fueled not by Mother Nature, by uncertainty and discord. We are in a time of increasing suspicion and hatred that threatens to tear apart our nation to the very seams. Now, in reaffirming the greatness of our country, we must first understand the ideals that make this country truly great. The institutionalization of freedom, democracy, liberty, and human equality. To me, America is not simply a name with a flag. America is a collection of hardworking men and women who, in the face of rising obstacles, simply refuse to give up. Unfortunately, obstacles that have been mounted on the shoulders of the average American have become one too many. And sadly, the source of many people's conflicted sense of patriotism. And if we want to help give a sense of pride, then first we must understand the reasons why Americans have lost a sense of patriotism to begin with. Americans today are struggling. It should be no surprise that Americans feel discouraged of the direction this country is headed. With an exponential decline in national debt, crippling foreclosures, degrading infrastructure, dwindling job market, and widening income gap between the rich and the poor, it's obvious that Americans are discontent. Worse still, the media seems different about the current state of affairs of our nation. Rather than help promote discussion about viable solutions to move forward, ad-driven 24-hour radio programs and news stations are content to stroke fires and sensationalize political differences. And because of the volatile nature of the American community, it is understandable if some will feel discouraged and show less patriotic feelings with America. I, too, have personally felt the impact on the average American. Throughout my entire life, my family has often struggled financially, as most families do, living from paycheck to paycheck, not knowing when our next meal will come from. And what I saw in my mother's eyes, those unfortunate times when we barely had enough to get by, brought me close to tears. I saw a proud, strong, courageous individual who simply refused to give in to the crushing despair that surrounded our family. I saw then what I now understand is American ideal. And instead of rejecting the promises of equal opportunity and prosperity that is the American dream, I instead took comfort from his creed. For a young man, divided by two entirely different cultures, without a firm understanding of his place in the world, without even the guidance of his father's steadying hand. It was this essential American idea, that we are not constrained by the circumstances of our birth and can make of our lives what we will. That's defined my life. just as defined the life of so many other Americans. Now, to those of you who ask yourselves, what difference will it make if Americans are patriotic? Why should I care? I will emphasize the fact that America is indeed in the midst of a raging storm, and that these unpatriotic feelings that spread through American society can very well be our very own undoing. Abraham Lincoln, that great American hero, once used the words, "A house divided cannot stand," to describe a broken nation. We cannot have patriots here and non-patriots here, just as our nation cannot be half slave and half free. The very source of our nation's power is in being one unified force and standing strong together in the face of anything or anyone who threatens our freedoms and liberties. But because of this lack of patriotism and unity in America today, we leave ourselves vulnerable. The very freedoms that we've all enjoyed may very well slip away from us, right before our very eyes. Living as a Native American and as an American citizen, there was a time when I asked myself, where do I dedicate myself? Do I go with my country or with my people? My tribal culture was on several occasions, forced to practice religion that wasn't our own, treated as second-class citizens, and now the very real threat of our language is appearing. We all know how important it is to know who you are, to be proud of yourself. And the only problem was that I wasn't quite sure who I was. I continued to question myself until one day I asked one of my tribal elders, and he told me the time he had fought in World War II alongside the Americans in the Pacific Theater. He had told me how to fight for. He had told me how it felt to fight for a nation which at one time had even denied him citizenship. And he told me, even though there are many atrocities committed by the U.S. government against Native Americans, this is still our land, our home, and if a sacrifice had to be made to defend it, then so be it. According to an article by Thomas D. Morgan in Army History magazine, more than 44,000 Native Americans served during World War II. They fought on all fronts of the conflict and were rewarded by receiving numerous medals. Now, it amazed me to think that given our past history with the U.S. government, that this man and so many others like him everywhere were willing to put their lives on the line for everything that America stood for. But I learned then that the greatest strength of our nation comes not from how many wars we won or the size of our arsenal, but rather the greatest strength of America is our people. And as long as there is someone willing to stand up and say, I am proud to be an American, this nation will always remain great. Now, we should realize that this problem that we all face, the loss of our American patriotism, is vital to our nation's future. Given the enormous problems that we face in the world today, we can no longer afford the sorts of divisions that this issue enacts. Paul Swinley had once said, how often we fail to realize our good fortune in living in a nation where happiness is more than a lack of tragedy. But it seems to me that we as a people tend to concentrate more on the negative aspects of our lives rather than the positive things. But ladies and gentlemen, we have to realize that although the United States may have its faults, it is still indeed a great nation. Throughout our history, men and women of far greater stature and significance than me have altered the course of history in the midst of monumentous debates. They did so not because they sought popularity or votes, but because they were the voices of the people. And we told them that we will always place our principles above personal gain, and that we will always seek reform or wrongs we committed in this country's name. The abolishment of segregation, the war we waged on discrimination, the march for equal rights for all, and the protests sending our kids to Vietnam. These are just some examples of the things that we have changed. The American people did not stand idly by and let the issue continue. We did not fade quietly tonight. We did not go out without a fight. Instead, we fought. Whether it was against our own countrymen or against society itself, we fought. Paying any price, bearing any burden, meeting any hardship, and supporting any friend to ensure the success and survival of those fundamental principles which this great country is founded on. And from those forebears of liberty, those Americans who have seen injustice within their borders, we inherit that same ability to create revolutions within the world we live in today. And now, because of their efforts, because of all our efforts, segregation and discrimination are no longer the face of our nation. We brought those kids back from Vietnam. And women have more rights now than ever before. And at these moments, America is not carried on simply because of the skill or vision of those high in office, but rather because we, the people, saw America as something bigger than the sum of our individual ambitions and greater than differences of birth or diversity customs. And in the end, I learned that what makes a patriot, of course, precisely because America is imperfect, precisely because our ideals constantly demand more from us, I learned that what makes America great has never been its perfection, but the belief that it can be made better. In the end, I came to understand that our revolution was waged for the sake of that belief, that we could be governed by laws, not men, that we could be equal in the eyes of those laws, that we could be free to say what we want and assemble with whomever we want, that we could be free to pursue our own dreams, but also be able to help our fellow citizens pursue theirs. In the end, I learned that patriotism is not the short, frenzied outburst of emotion, but the tranquil and steady dedication of a lifetime, that a patriot should not be content merely waving the flag, but should also strive to make our country unified and strong. For I believe that our country is not the only thing we owe our allegiance to, but we also owe our allegiance to our fellow countrymen and women. And just like those patriots at Valley Forge and those countless others who created change, let us again change our nation so that we all may benefit. To bridge this gap that's formed between the American people, instead of concentrating on issues that further separate us, let us instead concentrate on solutions that bring us together. For there is nothing the Americans cannot accomplish when diversity is replaced with common purpose and unity over discord. Now, none of us expect these changes to happen overnight, but surely we can all agree that change has to happen, that the greatness of this country stems from the American people, their toil, their drive, their restlessness, and their quiet heroism. And if anyone on this planet can solve this problem, then surely it must be the American people. So now, my fellow countrymen, I leave you with a challenge, to bear the torch with the answers that carry, to show a little more love for this great nation of ours, to maybe volunteer time to help another fellow countryman in need, to support our troops overseas, to be active in politics and make sure the best possible solutions for our nation are being made in Washington, to hopefully avert what could quite possibly go down as the greatest American tragedy. And to remember that no matter what happens, we are all of us Americans.